To take the rhino, for example, on your Instagram, there's photos, and on the website for African Wildlife Vets, photos of the dehorning process, and it looks really brutal. But why is that kind of drastic measure necessary in the conservation of rhinos?
Yeah, so it looks very brutal. It definitely does. I mean, when you're taking a chainsaw to even a tree, it looks brutal. So to take it to a living animal, it's a little bit difficult for some people to swallow. But pretty much, so what's happened in those recent dehornings, this is the first time we've attempted it on such a massive scale in what we call the open system. So when I keep saying the open system, it's sort of the areas that are adjacent to the Kruger National Park that do not have a fenced boundary with the Kruger. So they're privately owned areas and run and managed, but they've completely open to the Kruger National Park. So it forms a massive sort of conservation area, but of different managed areas. And dehorning has only really happened in much smaller reserves and it's much smaller populations because it's easier to manage and it's a lot more economical and cost effective if you're doing a small population of rhino. Now we're talking about a population of 200, 250 rhino, even more if you consider the populations that didn't dehorn. So what was happening is the two reserves that initially decided, you know what, that's it, we're going to attempt this dehorning, is that they'd run out of all other options. They'd put an immense amount of money into security. They'd put an immense amount of money into anti-poaching, into all sort of facets in an attempt to curb the poaching, which didn't really help. They were still losing an incredible amount of rhino. The two reserves that we'd done on it both lost anywhere between 60 to 100 rhino in the last 6 years. So, it got to a point where they simply had to try something else. And dehorning was something that was happening on smaller properties, and it seemed to be showing positive effects. So they thought, you know what, this is a Hail Mary. Let's give it an attempt and see what happens, because we really don't have anything to lose. And, at the end of the day, security actually is an incredible strain on a budget. It's very expensive. Helicopters and thermal imaging and equipment and salaries and boots on the ground is quite expensive. So the attempt at dehorning wasn't what we'd call a silver bullet. It wasn't going to be the thing that stopped poaching. It wasn't going to be the cure for poaching or the best anti-poaching method out there at all. But it was just something else to add on top of the high security levels and on top of the efforts that were being put in to try and mitigate that. And so the dehorning is pretty much to remove that off a rhino, which it is a target for poachers. So you're taking that horn away, you're trying to break the ratio of the risk rewards, because every time a poacher walks into a protected area, he risks being arrested, he risks losing his life, he risks getting injured out there by another wild animal, whatever it may be, versus the reward, which is getting that horn and eventually selling it on, and it was a much higher reward for what they'd call sort of relatively low risk. So you wanted to bring that down. So the risk stays the same. The risk hasn't changed at all, because the security is still there. Your anti-poaching units are still full force ahead. But now you've brought that reward dramatically down, because now instead of getting 8 kilos of horn or 6 kilos of horn off a massive bull, they're getting, a little bit that's left behind. So now it's like, okay, whoa, maybe we shouldn't actually go into that reserve, because that's just not worth it anymore.
And do you know if they have any of the metrics for the success of programs like that?
So it's obviously still ongoing. We're probably coming up now. It's almost, what are we on now? So it's just over a year from when we started the process last year. And they've lost, I couldn't give you the exact numbers now because it's still ongoing between all the reserves. But it's been a dramatic reduction. I mean, ridiculous. And we're not even talking just in losing animals, just poaching incursions, so tracks. So when we talk about an incursion, we talk about a group of poachers moving into a reserve that's been picked up on the boundary fence or wherever it may be. So they know that there's people that are in the reserve looking for rhino or, just looking to cause trouble. And sort of soon after the dehorning in 2 of the reserves, the incursion rate dropped to 0 for the first sort of, I think it was almost 3 months. It was almost 0 incursions that they had, no incidents. There were a handful of rhino. I want to say it's sort of like 2 or 3 animals that have been lost in a year.
Wow. What impact does it have on the rhino? I understand that it's similar to fingernails, so that may not necessarily hurt, but does it have an impact on sort of like their social structures or anything like that, or how they interact with other rhinos?
So it doesn't appear to be. There's still a lot of ongoing research with that, because obviously that's a question we get a lot from people. But interestingly enough, rhinos are not the greatest mothers, if you could say that, in terms of protecting calves, and that they don't outwardly need their horn for something like that. That's the biggest thing we get. Or they're not going to start getting attacked. They can't protect themselves against predators. Not really. It doesn't seem to. We're not suddenly seeing lions are eating a whole load more rhinos since we started dehorning. It simply just doesn't happen. So the biggest issue is territorial bulls. You just don't want to run in, because we're such an open system and a free flowing of animals. You want to make sure you get all the animals, because you don't want a territorial bull that's got a horn, end up fighting with a bull that doesn't have a horn. That's obviously a semblance of risk over there. We've still had bulls, both dehorned, having proper goes at each other. Whether or not that's going to affect things, whereas they'd have killed each other in the past, because one of them would have ended up being stronger and would end up with those horrific injuries I spoke about. Now that they're both dehorned, can they really do that much damage to each other that actually ends up in one dying or moving out of the territory, or what happens over there? But sort of what the consensus has been is that any negative effects, let's say the predation increased 10%, it's never going to be, and it's just throwing figures out there. But let's say, lions started killing 3-4 more rhino calves a year than they did in general. That negative effect, based on the negative effect of poaching, it's just not even comparable. So we haven't seen any negative effects in the populations that we've dehorned that would suggest that it's a bad idea, considering what we were losing for poaching. Having said that, it's not an extremely long-lived species, but it is quite. So, all these studies, the worst thing is you need time, and you almost need to continue with the procedure, because if we stop dehorning, then you can't really tell what the long-term effects actually are. We need to look 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, and actually see, is there something? Because immediately we won't really be able to tell.